in any sense, has to be worse for you than your death is, because it's something that you will actually experience. It is worth pointing out a few assumptions that might be embedded here. One is that death really is the end. Of course, if there is some kind of afterlife, and that afterlife is good, then killing them might be doing them a favor, and so it would still be morally worse to give them a haircut from their perspective. But suppose they were going to hell, your free action to kill them, if it happens to come at a point in their life when, say, they don't believe in God and that sends them to hell, you might have been basically responsible for sending them to hell there. That would be worse from their perspective than a bad haircut. Probably. Bad haircuts can really, really ruin my day. But it's interesting how the commenter didn't just say that this would be worse for the person, but morally worse. As if the moral rightness or wrongness of an action kind of depends on the victim's views on the matter, on how the victim feels about the action. There are some ethical theories which do treat this as if it's true. For example, consequentialist theories like utilitarianism. The way that somebody reacts in terms of the amount of suffering that they experience is the determinate factor in the morality of an action. With utilitarianism, though, of course, you can't just consider that person's viewpoint, the suffering that they experience. You have to consider the impact that any action will have on the suffering of the world in general, altogether. And so to say that something is morally worse for somebody from their perspective would seem to imply a view of ethics where the only thing that's relevant in determining whether something is morally right or wrong for you is your viewpoint on the matter, which is essentially a kind of moral subjectivism. But if the point being made here is just that in your subjective assessment, the haircut would feel worse than your death, this is just making a kind of trivial point about subjective preferences. I could say this about any two options. I could say that if one person just for whatever reason happens to prefer being tortured for 1,000,000 years versus living with their family for a normal 80-year existence, then from their perspective, that would be the morally preferable thing. Sure, but that's kind of uninteresting. It's just saying that on subjective ethics, your subjective preference determines what's ethical. Yeah, that's pretty straightforward. The death case is a bit more interesting, though, in that you're kind of forced into a particular preference. It's not just, well, if you happen to prefer this or prefer that. It's like you can't experience anything when you're dead, and so you can't have preferences when you're dead. And so the bad haircut has to be worse for you. Some people will dispute this. There's a big philosophical literature on what, if anything, makes death bad. I'd like to do a video on it at some point in the future. But for example, there is the deprivation account, which says that death is bad for the person who dies because of what it deprives them of. The problem is, of course, that they don't experience the deprivation. And so one response to this view is to say that deprivation can only be bad if you're aware that you're being deprived. Another interesting problem is that the moment you try to ascribe some positive badness to death, especially in a kind of quantifiable sense, like the number of experiences you're being deprived of, you seem to run into this problem. Suppose you compare Shakespeare and Mac Miller, right? They're both dead. But Shakespeare has been deprived of many more experiences than Mac Miller because he's been dead much longer. So is death worse for Shakespeare, like right now, than it is for Mac Miller right now? That doesn't seem quite right. Well, one response to this is to say that the deprivation account only applies to things you're deprived of that you otherwise would have experienced given a natural course of human life. So like 80, 90, 100 years or so. But that seems kind of arbitrary because, at least in principle, we could one day extend human lifespans. Imagine we develop some technology at some point in the future which allows us to live for 1,000 years. Would it be that at that moment that technology is developed, it suddenly becomes worse for Shakespeare to be dead? Because in principle, if he'd had access to that technology, he could have lived for 1,000 years and still be alive today. That still doesn't seem quite right either. There's been a lot said and written about the concept of death in philosophy by people like Shelley Kagan or Thomas Nagel, and like I say, I might make a video on it at some point in the future. But suffice to say, the idea that death isn't actually bad for the person who dies is a relatively mild, common philosophical take, and even when it's dressed up in the specificity of a bad haircut being worse for the person than their own death, it remains, I'm afraid to say, mild. You know, one relatively mild take that was pointed out to me not long ago is that I used to walk around with a massive bulge in my trousers. Let me say that again. I used to have way too much stuff in my pockets, and it looked a bit ridiculous. Even when I was giving talks and stuff, my wallet was bulging out of the side of my leg. I fixed that problem when Exter sent me some replacements. Exter's wallets and card holders are slim, and they hold your cards in a pop-up mechanism for easy access. I've been using the Card Holder Pro. It's made of recycled aluminium with no plastic. It holds up to 14 cards. It fits great in the hand, and it's got a lifetime warranty on it too. And it comes in 7 different colors, making it easy to personalize for yourself, but also making it a great gift to personalize for somebody else. So I've been trying this new way of accessing my cards for a while now, and it genuinely has just made my life a lot easier, as well as solving the problem in my trousers. And I also have Exter's Finder card, which slots into the back of any of their wallets or card holders. I've got it linked to the Find My app on my iPhone, meaning I can see its exact location on a map, and if I'm within 300 feet, I can press a button on my phone
interview session.